As far as Assassin's Creed games go, the series, despite its evolution over the years, has had at least one through line, that being their third-person action-adventure elements. Even when the worlds became bigger, stories stretched thinner, and the ties to the series' roots began rotting, the canvas was the same. Third-person, open world. So imagine what people thought when it was announced that there would be a spin-off called Assassin's Creed Chronicles that would feature the series in a new perspective, 2.5D side-scrolling. Rather, don't imagine it. Let's look for ourselves. Don't say it's a good game, but not a good Assassin's Creed game. Please, 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 please don't say it's a good game, but not a good Assassin's Creed game. Fuck! Interestingly, it seemed that each subsequent release in the Chronicles trilogy was rated worse and worse by both fans and critics. As suspected, there are some who flat out hated these, and I'll admit that when I first played Chronicles China, I didn't like it at all. I didn't like that the combat wasn't viable. I didn't like that the art style was both visually interesting but masked in a bland color palette. I thought the later levels were frustrating and felt that the game was way too linear. As I've replayed the games and widened my experience with other stealth games, I realized that my expectations were likely to be the culprit behind my less than ideal first impression. I went in expecting the same tropes and features of the mainline games, and when those features were abandoned due to not translating to 2.5D well, or were reworked to fit, I was disappointed. It's clear from reading others' thoughts that they had similar issues to me. I bring up this issue with expectations because once I tailored my expectations and desires to what the game offered, I enjoyed it a lot more. I'm not saying you're wrong for not enjoying these games for these reasons. Rather, I'm saying that you may enjoy these games more if you adjust the lens through which you view the game. When discussing the appeal of Assassin's Creed, many have shared the love of the power fantasy, one reinforced by chain killing, multiple pistols, and flashy movement. Stealth was always an option in these games, but one that was encouraged less and less as the games evolved. While early games had instant fail stealth segments, many scenarios saw you seamlessly transitioning from quiet to loud strategies within seconds of being spotted. This, in many ways, pleased both fans of stealth and combat, as if you wanted pure stealth, you could just reload a checkpoint and try again upon being caught. And if you liked combat, then you could skip the quiet part altogether. Even people like myself who enjoy both were able to have their hands in both the cookie jars. An immediate problem that comes from the aforementioned customs of the mainline games is that when entering Chronicles, having combat delegated to the last resort marginally inferior to its low-key counterpart, acting as a death sentence more than anything, feels restrictive. But once I became accustomed to the Chronicles playstyle, forgoing my want to fit this spin-off into the mainline box, I found myself appreciating it so much more. So while discussing these games, I'll be looking at them as spin-offs, and looking at how they adapt and reject the many features of the mainline series. It's also important to note that these games were not developed by Ubisoft, and rather Climax Studios, the same company that made that really cool Ghost Rider game for the PS2. The first game in the Chronicles trilogy was Chronicles China, but it's not where our story begins. Rather, it builds off of plot elements in Assassin's Creed Embers and Freedom Cry. The precursor box featured in Freedom Cry is what surrounds these three titles, but the stories suffer the same fate as Freedom Cry. China stars a protege apprentice of an older Ezio, Xiaojun, who receives a precursor box from her late mentor before it eventually falls into Templar hands. Her story ends with the box out of her grasp and within that of Arbaz. Arbaz does a similar song and dance to Xiaojun, with the box arriving in Russia by the end of his story, being then picked up by Nikolai of the Russian Brotherhood. The stories here have elements that are interesting and do show promise, but we won't see much of it, as it's left to cutscenes playing before and after memories. What we do see is beautiful. China resembles old Chinese paintings, India of much the same, and Russia was reminiscent of the propaganda of the time. They are all widely unique to each other and have their own strengths and weaknesses. China, while resembling the art of the time, is left feeling bland and washed out. It has moments of brilliance for sure, but I always desired more color and flair. Even during the moments where something as lively as fire was on screen, I didn't feel the threatening heat that should pop from something so bright. This doesn't stop the game from achieving visual feats that immerse you in the world, and the cutscenes especially are presented beautifully, but in a very subjective manner, I wanted more color. Fortunately, more color is exactly what Chronicles India brings. Colors are brighter, the palette more diverse, and the cutscenes equally vibrant. But hue variety is not all that's here, as the game features two precursor sites, both featuring the sleek sci-fi architecture indicative of the Isu. Some could struggle to identify key objects when everything seems to pop, but I personally never had an issue, and if you did, you'll love Russia. Now, anything interactable is in giant red, whilst everything else remains muted. It's highly stylized, but rarely catches up to the other games in terms of flair. The backgrounds work especially well given the contrast to the foreground, but you'd be hard-pressed to find much else that stands out. Even Nikolai himself is a shade of gray muted enough to blend in, which perhaps was intentional, but I doubt it. UIs and everything outside the world are easy on the eyes and convey necessary information, and despite the color of the vision cones being the same shade as the the rest of the world, it's distinct enough to not be lost in the sea of gray. These art styles are what distinguish this miniseries from its larger whole. Yes, the 2.5D perspective is a radical change, but really, despite Assassin's Creed always being visually pleasing, their art styles have never been anything outside of realism. One could argue that some games attempted to find an identity in imitated oil paintings, but Chronicles is where I believe the games had a visual style that was both unique and appealing. It's a shame that the bar wasn't then raised for the soundtrack, as the music is often a few decibels away from mild ambience or even silence. And the constant remixes of the admittedly iconic Ezio's family began to feel grating through repetition alone. Regardless, these are some of the most distinctive art styles here, and just one frame could tell you what game this is. But I can acknowledge and agree that albeit a very pleasing palette cannot carry a game, it's in the gameplay that Chronicles makes another choice to not abandon the series, but redefine it. The Assassin's Creed games have always provided choice in your playstyle. Chronicles takes a different route, and while not limiting you to stealth, does everything it can to discourage a loud approach. Going in loud is the hardest means of completing a task and rewards the lowest score, pertinent in strengthening your character. This would be a problem if the stealth weren't a good amount of fun, most of the time. And this is one of the first strange occurrences within Chronicles, which despite stealth being encouraged, it seems that most of the new, well-thought-out challenges are delegated to open combat. Your stealth abilities consist of hiding, crouching, and takedowns. Hiding spots are highlighted well, and there's a dedicated means of dashing from one to the other. These worked well enough, though the controls are a bit awkward, and it doesn't help that the controls change between games. In China, your sprint was mapped to R2, which would be held down at all times, as most enemies won't hear you sprinting at them until it's too late. There are some obstacles like birds that require you to walk slow, but these were a testament to letting go of R2 being the exception. When hiding, I'd naturally use R2 to move faster, and I'd be moving left and right. In India and Russia, you can press R2 to exit a hiding spot in a sprint, rather than exiting a hiding spot then having to sprint. It's great for fluidity, but when sprinting into cover, then waiting to adjust my position, I would end up peeking out unintentionally. This isn't the game's fault, mind you, it's just a result of muscle memory, but I figure I couldn't have been the only one to have this issue. Takedowns make enough noise to prevent you from slaughtering a whole room mindlessly, and can be performed from just about anywhere. Above, below, from a hiding place, haystack, anything within reason, including the speedier slide kills and jump kills. I found jump kills to be needlessly tedious as they conflict with another mechanic. When jumping at the enemy, if you don't kill them, the player will just bounce off of them. It kills the momentum and it doesn't affect the guard in any meaningful way. When attempting to jump kill an enemy, despite doing what the game tells me, it felt as though it just didn't register. This was an issue in China primarily, and while I can admit when I suck at something, i.e. struggling with combat, this issue truly felt like the game was just dropping inputs sometimes. Takedowns and hiding are mainline staples that translate easily into 2.5D, but eagle vision is one that could use some reworking, lest it become irrelevant. Most enemies here are visible, and when they're not, their vision cones are. Eagle vision is instead used as a way to highlight important enemies for challenges, while also showing what materials guards are carrying, preventing the tedium of looting every body looking for just one damn smoke bomb. An NPC's pathing will also be highlighted too, which while not integral was useful in select scenarios. On New Game Plus Hard, vision cones are only visible through eagle vision, giving it further utility, and acting as a saving grace. My only issue is that in some cases enemies could detect me outside their vision cones, especially when hanging, but it wasn't more than an inconvenience. Eyes are not the only thing capable of giving away your position, as animals too will make noise when you get too close or move too quickly, and wind chimes can make noise to alert guards. The tools will be familiar to any fan of the mainline, and each game features a few variables and tools that accomplish the same task. For Xiaojun, it's throwing knives, a straight line used for cutting ropes. Arbaz has his chakrams, which do the same thing but with a ricochet, enabling a pinch of added complexity. Nikolai has his gun, which is another straight shot with the added benefit of use in combat. I'll categorize these as projectiles, while the other tools are distractions and stuns. Distractions are tools that may move an enemy to a designated spot, and stuns are self-explanatory, stunning an enemy, creating an opening. Then you have your infinite use whistle, which will attract guards to your location. This is present in the same way across the three entries and is a bare-bones tool only used when other resources have been drained. Every assassin also has a rope or other means of ascending to ceiling handholds and taking down enemies from ledges. The final ability is the Helix consumables, which are glitches in the animus that allow you to perform supernatural feats. Dashing from hiding places renders you invisible, hide bodies, and even vanish in plain sight. These abilities were regulated by the amount of Helix cores within levels, so they naturally act as a very limited get-out-of-jail-free card. The Helix strike allows you to one-shot most enemies and dash towards them, making combat encounters survivable. These abilities are a great addition when the level is designed with them in mind, and when that isn't the case it can prevent the hundreds of reloads when attempting to not be spotted. If you are spotted, you'll likely be dead within a few seconds. Our characters are glass knives, only 1 or 2 hits from death, making combat difficult. Pair this with your minimal damage output and we have a combat system that is discouraged, which is fine, but I then wonder why it's so fleshed out. For comparison's sake, every enemy is defeated the same way in stealth. A few exceptions are here, like the brutes who need to be first stunned before attacking and the gas mask wearing guards in Russia that are invulnerable to smoke, but otherwise it's just a button press. This makes sense, as the challenge is instead left to isolating the target and navigating the different layouts. If an enemy is up high and watching the guards below, you'll need to sneak up to the top and work your way down. But in combat, there are a variety of enemies that can block a few attacks, block all attacks, can hit you with a single and multi-hit combo, some can roll over you, some can shoot you, some can do both, and when there is more than one enemy, you're in for a challenge. You can attack with light and heavy variations, and rather than countering, you can block attacks, which will leave the enemy open to either a counterattack or a roll which will position you behind the enemy. If a gun is pointed at you, you'll be able to dodge it with proper timing, but the real challenge here is that the AI is quite smart. If there are two gun-wielding guards, one will duck while the other fires from behind him, and so on. It's good stuff, and my criticism here isn't with the seemingly unnecessary depth, but rather the game's insistence on discouraging you. Not only is combat much harder than regular stealth, it yields the lowest score. Score, as mentioned, is integral to progression, and the highest score is given to the quietest players. The best score is awarded to the ghosts that are never seen, and make no impact on the patrols, no killing, spotting, nothing. It makes sense that this rewards you, as it's the most difficult route, and the satisfaction of infiltrating fortresses with guards none the wiser is reward enough. But if you kill one guard, regardless of if that body is found, you'll be granted the assassin style, which yields lower points. Engage in any combat and you'll receive the brawler medal, offering the slimmest rewards. An issue I have here is that regardless of passing through 90% of a scenario in stealth, if you are spotted for a split second at the end and decide to engage in combat, you get the brawler medal, and usually not a good one. I won't harp on this too much because it's only an issue in China, with India and Russia opting to add a different non-lethal style that rounds things out, and lumps open combat into the stealth style, but this creates a new challenge. In China, you could get gold medals in Brawler, and it would garner enough points to unlock the upgrades at the end of the level. In India and Russia, open combat will almost guaranteed net you a bronze medal in the new assassin style, which is below the non-lethal silencer style. This is because being spotted lowers your score. This means that combat yields little score and prevents you from unlocking things like extra health, more damage, and other upgrades that are only of use to players opting for combat. Even with these rewards that make combat more forgiving, you are, unless doing a bare bones run, never going to engage in combat. I would have enjoyed more stealth upgrades. There's plenty here, but when a slot offers more health, it means nothing. Health is only a factor in combat, as getting spotted with 4 health bars is the same as 1. You'll be reloading the checkpoint. The same goes for combat damage. The only exception is boss fights, which are few and relatively easy. They see you in a one-on-one battle against an enemy with no tricks or special gimmicks, which was disappointing. The best case of this was the fight against Burns, which at least saw him attempting to zone and poison you. I found that the better boss fights were those that served as long-winded stealth segments with your target at the end. Alternatively, there are levels that see you being scored on time rather than style. These were enjoyable and at their peak in India, with tricky platforming within the precursor sites. The quirks of the control scheme are highlighted here, such as when clambering up a ledge. Your instinct may be to push to the right, but this will instead swing you around the corner. The correct control is to push up. It makes sense, but it will take some adjusting. I've spoken about the games broadly thus far, but it is true that there were many improvements added to the entries following China. India specifically is a major step up as far as tools and quality of life are concerned. Having a crouch sprint is minor, but adds needed speed to an otherwise methodical game. So rather than talk about every different pixel, let's look at the larger changes which feature the reworked styles, but reworked level design too. Chronicles China is simplistic in nature. That's not to say it's bad, many consider China to be the best, but that in comparison, it feels as though it plays it safe, leading to a consistent experience. There are 2 timed missions, with speed and otherwise high-octane backdrops being present in those 2 instances. There are also no precursor sites. Pit this against India, which has 5 timed levels, and we see that action was a higher priority. This contrast works in the game's favor, as Chronicles was relatively low-key, and by the time I got to India, the greater adventure was appreciated more. The precursor site was a good change of pace scenery-wise, as China featured a tried-and-true find-and-kill target formula, but Russia is where the level design strikes a mostly happy medium. Russia features plenty high-octane segments, with the highlight being the escape and eventual defeat of a tank, but the lack of precursor architecture makes me almost miss the overexposure of such sites from India. Russia and India also had a leg up over China when it came to depth. Multiple segments in India see our boss traversing the deeper levels to move to new areas, building upon the foundation set in China, but felt as though it lacked the freedom of China. The real differentiator here is the enemy layout and the player freedom. China had a consistent level of situations where you could truly approach it from any angle, and those choices multiplied when you had consumables. Run through and use combat to create a loud and aggressive approach, take out every guard in a room leaving a bloody record of your accomplishments, or slip by unnoticed. I'll admit I enjoyed the stealth options more simply for the thought of the in-universe townspeople talking about a man held up in a fortress in broad daylight, surrounded by hundreds of guards, and then being stabbed without anybody knowing. But repeat playthroughs are enjoyable too, because even within one style, say the ghost style, you can distract guards in different ways from different spots through different routes. This was a freedom not entirely recaptured in India. The first mission is restricted to making use of the silencer non-lethal takedowns, and while it could be argued that this is done to showcase the new takedowns, a simple tutorial could have sufficed. And if this was done with lore in mind, as our boss does mention that he doesn't need to kill, the gameplay itself doesn't seem to follow much canon in how you take enemies down thus far. That, and it directly contradicts itself with Russia and the assassins wanting to do you know what. Couple this with a greater emphasis on set-piece based action and we have a game that contains more variety, but less replayability. There's only one way to traverse the precursor traps, one way to move through the levels, and the worst perpetrator of this is the Red Giant. Russia is an interesting game because it has some of the most unique ideas in the trilogy, both in terms of gameplay and story, yet it fails to stick the landing on both fronts. I've hidden a detail up to this point about Russia because spoilers, so if you are interested in playing these games, feel free to click off. And what I've hidden is that you play as two different characters, that being Nikolai and Anastasia. Nikolai has access to all the usual assassin tools, with his winch offering variety in puzzles and distractions, but he lacks the helix abilities that our boss had. This does make interactions more difficult, as while I still enjoyed India, I felt that it was easiest because of the helix abilities. Instead, your helix abilities are reserved for the other playable character, Anastasia. Anastasia is granted helix abilities, but nothing in the way of tools or gear. This makes her segments a different challenge compared to Nikolai and were highlights almost every time. The issue that arises is that the levels have to be designed around the player having a certain amount of their helix bar filled, which the layouts are, but then it creates a scripted feeling. When the layout in front of you asks that you move through a straight patrol without being seen, there are only so many ways to do that. And more often than not, just one. It also means that these solutions are telegraphed, as the presence of helix cores on the path forward is a direct indicator that you'll be using them within a few seconds. This scripted feeling applies to Nikolai's segments too, as I felt that there were less ways for me to approach something. To be fair, this could be a player issue. I've experimented plenty to no success, but perhaps I'm not looking or trying hard enough. Regardless, I felt as though Russia saw a lesson focus on improvisation and multiple solutions to a problem. In China, if a strategy didn't work, I always felt like there was another option. In Russia, it seemed that I just had to continue throwing myself against the proverbial brick wall until my trial and error revealed the path forward. The reason this pains me is because there are interesting twists in Russia's gameplay, notably in terms of distractions. You can cut lights, power lines, and use telephones to call guards over. It provides a game with higher highs but much lower lows, as some of the layouts here felt downright annoying, especially when restricted to, for example, the assassin style when protecting Anastasia from the guards on the train. So despite China on paper having the fewest tools available to you, I feel it has the most freedom in how you use your limited tools. If you want more practice, then you can take part in the challenge rooms within India and Russia. They feature the white shards indicative of the Animus simulation, and some challenge requirements. Each challenge boils down to moving through a room to get a target, but there are 3 optional objectives that if done will yield bonus medals and unlock more challenges. One is for finishing within a time limit, another is not being seen at all, and the last is usually some kind of requirement to kill while sliding, hiding, or jumping. These medals carry over, so you can do one run focusing on time and another focusing on not being spotted, and by the end you'll have 2 medals. But because I'm an ape masquerading as an intellectual, I assumed that you had to get all 3 in one run, meaning I played the living hell out of these and gave myself a brutally hard challenge that I enjoyed. I felt as though I had to have no mistakes within these confines, and it showed me that with enough practice, this slow and methodical gameplay can transform into a fluid performance. I also found that traps were just a pain in the neck. They can instantly kill you and are easily defused by shooting a power box or holding a button up to it. They are speed bumps more than anything and could have been left out like they were in China. In China, the closest we get to traps are wind chimes, which are easily avoidable without killing the pace, and are not an instant fail if hit. A similar sentiment is shared when moving through water, as while it does slow the player down, it does not outright halt them. So, the possibilities of a new setting and perspective have been mostly realized in Chronicles. Environments and countries are done justice with fluid and fun gameplay, but how is the story? How are these 4 characters connected? By a very loose thread. The main plot device in all these games is that precursor box, given to Xiaojun by her mentor Ezio Auditore. And what does this box do? Whatever the plot desires. The box is a MacGuffin for the trilogy's runtime and acts as a loose connection between the games. This would be fine if the stories were good, but in fact, the box is often the overarching goal for our characters, and yet the plot succeeds in making it as uninteresting as possible. Our plot begins in China following the events of Assassin's Creed Embers, a short film that, while offering further context to the game, isn't necessary viewing, though I would still recommend it. The long story short short is that after training with an old and eventually dying Ezio, Xiaojun returns to China, the last of her brotherhood there, and uses the precursor box as a means of getting herself recaptured, and once escaping begins her massacre of the 8 Tigers, a group of highly influential Templars. This is done out of revenge for her people, and I won't explain it any further because Stevie Wonder could see where this is going. Along the way, she meets with an assassin named Wang who she entrusts with the box, but as she kills the second in command of the Tigers, she finds out that the leader, Zhang Yong, is hunting Wang. She fails to save Wang, and eventually, with nowhere left to run, she enlists the help of the Empress who used to be a concubine like her. But when arriving, we see that it was a trap. She escapes and finds that Yong is going to allow the Mongols to invade China as a means of securing further power, but he is stopped by Xiaojun, but not before telling her that the box has left China. By now, Xiaojun realizes that, drumroll please, revenge bad! I'm sorry, I don't mean to be that much of an asshole, but we've seen this plot so many times and the sentiment has been hammered into us so much that I immediately check out when the writing's on the walls. I can appreciate the other aspects of the story, like Xiaojun's voice actor do a great job, and I can appreciate a smaller game having a smaller story. And my issue here isn't even the execution of its ideas, but rather the idea itself. I don't expect a complex plot, and truthfully, my main concern is the gameplay, which was always entertaining enough to make the plot a minor blemish on the bigger picture. It's unfortunate then that India and Russia would attempt to up the ante in ways that were to their own detriment. India stars our boss during the Sixth conflict against the East India Company. In his brotherhood's possession is the Koh-i-Noor, a powerful diamond precursor artifact that can be used to open the ways to precursor sites in India. As our boss visits his love interest, Princess Piara, he gets word that the Brotherhood has been attacked and that the diamond has been taken along with our boss's mentor Hamid. After rescuing Hamid, our boss learns that William Sleeman is wanting to use the diamond and the box to unlock the secrets of precursor sites, but not before our boss, in an attempt to stop him, causes the site to collapse on itself. Sleeman then heads to Afghanistan with Arbaz giving chase. After hearing that Sleeman left the artifacts in the possession of Alexander Burns, Arbaz snatches the artifacts and heads back home. With word of Sleeman's attack on the palace and upon Arbaz's arrival, he sees that Sleeman has Piara hostage. Arbaz trades the artifact for her life, and as she is escaping, Piara stabs him, allowing Arbaz to quickly take the diamond. He explains that the box will be retrieved by other assassins and that it's not his concern. The story here was far more straightforward. Chasing a man across India was entertaining for how simple it was, and the moral of the story wasn't revenge, but nothing at all. There was no overarching theme, which didn't disappoint me. What does disappoint me is that the plot threads are opened but not really closed, and the ones that are closed feel underdeveloped. A prime example is Piara, who is shown to be a love interest but is used for nothing more than motivating Arbaz to give up the box, with the only payoff to her character being her stabbing Sleeman with her blade, which called back to the discussion her and Arbaz had at the beginning of the game, where it's implied that Arbaz has been training her to defend herself. Aside from that one exception, the overarching story is quite bland, with the only redeeming facet being the charming dialogue from Arbaz on scene-by-scene basis. I desired a premise with more depth and intrigue, which is exactly what Russia attempts. Russia sees Nikolai wanting to leave Russia with his family. Passports are at the ready, but he decides to do one last job: recover the precursor box. He follows his lead to the Romanov house, witnessing the execution of the Tsar family by the hands of Templars until he sees that youngest daughter, Anastasia. She has the precursor box, and it interacts with Nikolai's shard on his neck to grant Anastasia the memories of Xiaojun, and through the bleeding effect, has her abilities. This helps Nikolai abandon his plans of leaving in order to bring Anastasia to the assassins, and once he does, the assassins decide to perform a surgery on her brain to understand why she has these memories. This surgery will likely kill her, and this causes the now attached Nikolai to go rogue and rescue her, killing many of his own along the way. Once the two escape, Anastasia then flees to Germany under the new name Anna Anderson, now learning to live with the memories of Xiaojun. This story had an excellent premise. Nikolai I could not care for, but the split personality of Xiaojun and Anastasia fighting over the same body was interesting, and I wanted to know more. Unfortunately, within this game, we don't get more than the foundation for such a mystery. What we can glean is that, as Anastasia can control Xiaojun, she can tap into her skills and bloodlust, and in moments of intense stress, it seems that her inner Xiaojun takes over for her as a means of self-preservation. This idea is reflected in gameplay in some excellent ways. I mentioned already that Anastasia has almost no tools or fighting capabilities, and instead has to rely on the skills and helix abilities of Xiaojun to survive. Narratively, this works, as by the time the third game comes around, we are very familiar with all the AI, our tools, and how to seamlessly flow from one patrol to another unnoticed. So we as the player project our knowledge onto Anastasia as Xiaojun does. It's also great hearing Anastasia say many of the same lines as Xiaojun does.
I am the blade in the shadows.
I am the blade in the shadows.
But why Anastasia gets these memories is unknown to me. I'm sure there is an answer somewhere, but I don't think it's presented in the cutscenes and it isn't clearly explained otherwise. It feels like an interesting idea that just goes nowhere, much like the question of if Anastasia should be operated on. I'm not saying we need to attempt to justify potentially killing someone, but we do need a reason. We should be able to understand why the assassins that are by their own code dedicated to keeping their blade from the innocents are now eager to endanger someone's life for the pursuit of potential knowledge. I apologize if this comes off as nitpicky, but this was the one part of the story I could really chew on, and it has great potential to provide something I've always appreciated about the Assassin's Creed games, which is when they present a situation and show you how two ideologies would handle it. Here we get the bare minimum of that, and it leaves me disappointed. This sentiment is shared across both the story and Russia overall. I felt as though it was the weakest of the trilogy, and at many points I was bored or frustrated with the enemy layouts to the point where had I not been making this video, I likely would not have finished the game. One thing that Russia has that the other two don't is a secret ending. Throughout the trilogy, you can find these symbols scattered on walls, and looking at them with eagle vision will show you a number. Enter all of these in at the main menu and you get a cutscene that more or less explains where the precursor box is in the modern day. And it ties the entire trilogy, Freedom Cry and Rogue 2 in a nice bow. I can't lie, I'm a sucker for hidden scenes and secrets like this, but it doesn't change that overall the stories here weren't great. It always felt as though we were watching only the second act of a larger narrative, in the way things weren't set up and barely paid off. I am impressed with how these games translate the staples of the series over to the 2.5D perspective. Leaps of faith not only synchronize your map, revealing collectibles, but still look as stylish as ever. Hiding in plain sight returns, and while the combat takes a back seat, the stealth here is more in-depth and more satisfying than mainline games. Social stealth is minor here, but its implementation always made sense. Level design was varied, and I appreciated gimmicks like walking through puddles that forced a briefly slower approach. The stories aren't great, but the objectives of finding a target, escaping through set pieces, and interacting with precursor objects and sites are great. So, unsurprisingly, my thoughts on the series parallel the general public's opinion, which is that the games are alright, but got worse with each entry. At least they had enjoyable gameplay to balance out the weaker stories. The best game is widely viewed as China, and I agree with that, though I do think India is a very close second. India was more scripted, which offered less freedom, but provided the best art style and some greater variety in both layouts and level design. The added quality of life changes were also so impactful that they made going back to China a larger adjustment than I really thought it would be. If I have a craving for this type of game, I'll be returning to China. I think the layouts were the best there, and while it is the most simplistic of the trilogy, it works in the game's favor. Things never become too complex for its own good, and the open-ended nature of the levels means each repeat playthrough could be something marginally different. I believe that this is what caused these games to stumble. The pursuit of complexity and higher ambitions at the foundation of this game simply couldn't bear the weight of. The new additions were fine, but they were always rendered useless by a new type of enemy. Smoke bombs are great, but when almost every late-game enemy in Russia has a gas mask, that tool loses all of its value. If you like the Chronicles trilogy, I highly recommend you also look at Mark of the Ninja, the game many would attribute Chronicles inspirations to. It's similar in gameplay but has a notably different art style, story, and quirks. I chose not to delve into the comparisons because it would detract from the purpose of this video, which is to see how these games compare to each other, and how they adapt the facets of the mainline games. I would still like to see these games return. They were priced well, and if they all play like China and India, I'd be happy to play them. If done the right way, a potential sequel could do really well, and give Xiaojun a mainline game, you bastards! Hello everyone, thank you for watching this video, I greatly appreciate it, and I also greatly appreciate our patrons and YouTube members whose names will be on screen right now. I hope you enjoyed seeing 3 games covered in one bigger video instead of, a 10-minute video on China, 10-minute video on India, and then another on Russia, which I'll admit I was tempted to do, but I thought, no, I should just try and cover all 3 of them because, and I was right to do this. I was worried that, I understand that not much changes between the games, and so I was like, oh, maybe, doing 3 separate videos would be redundant, and it would be a lot of like, hey, nothing's changed, so let's move on kind of thing. Or it would lead to a lot of repetitive sentiments across the 3 videos. So for that reason, I did it all in one big video, and I think it worked out better that way. And that means that as far as Assassin's Creed games go, I'm getting to the end. I just have to do Rogue, and then I might do Bloodlines. And then I gotta make, I'm sighing because I know it's gonna be a lot of work, but I am excited to do it. And then I gotta rank the Assassin's Creed games. And that's gonna be a shit show. Just because we already know my opinions on the series are quite different from the more vocal minority of the fan base. And that clearly has not gotten me into trouble ever before. Aside from that, I'm working on other videos. Gotham Knights, as of recording, comes out soon. I hope the game's good, but you know how it is. The game could be good, actually. Like, I'm expecting it to be decent, but you know, I'm not setting myself up for disappointment. I'll say that. Yeah. So I have that pre-ordered. I'm hoping I can play it right away, and then hopefully get a video out on it within. I mean, it's the 16th of October as I record this, and I'm hoping I can get a video out on the game by like November-ish. Hopefully, maybe, I don't know. And yeah, thank you so much to Shaun for editing this video. He is incredible. We love Shaun. Yeah, that's all I got. So thank you so much for hanging out with me, watching another video. I hope you guys are staying safe and staying healthy. I love you all, and take care. Oh, there's a new episode of the podcast with me and Nick, and you can follow my Twitter too. I'm sorry, I'm so bad at remembering that stuff. Okay, bye-bye.